In a peaceful corner of London, not far from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, life moved at its usual pace. Tourists snapped photos, children chased pigeons, and locals enjoyed their afternoon strolls. The air was filled with the soft hum of chatter and occasional laughter. Standing tall amidst this lively scene was Private James Harper, a member of the Royal Guard. Dressed in his striking red uniform and towering bearskin hat, he stood like a statue, his posture perfect and unwavering. His duty was to protect and represent the monarchy, even if it meant standing still for hours on end. Nearby, an older man named Victor Langley walked through the park. Unlike most visitors who came to admire the beauty of the palace or enjoy the serene surroundings, Victor carried an air of bitterness. Known for his prejudiced views, he often made snide comments about people different from him. Today, however, his focus was on James. As soon as Victor noticed the guard's mixed-race features, his face twisted into a scowl. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head disapprovingly. A few passers-by glanced at him, but quickly looked away, sensing trouble brewing. Victor wasn't satisfied with just glaring. He stepped closer to James, his voice rising as he began hurling insults. "You don't belong here," he spat, his tone dripping with venom. "This is no place for someone like you." His words were loud enough to draw attention, causing nearby tourists to turn their heads. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared in disbelief. But James didn't flinch. Trained to remain composed under any circumstances, he kept his gaze straight ahead, refusing to let Victor's hatred affect him. The tension escalated when Victor unleashed his Doberman, a sleek and powerful dog that had been straining against its leash. With a sharp command, Victor pointed at James and yelled, "Go!" The dog sprang forward, its muscles rippling as it charged toward the guard. Its teeth gleamed, and its growls sent shivers down the spines of those watching. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and some people instinctively backed away, fearing what might happen next. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding them from the chaos unfolding before their eyes. Despite the danger, James remained rooted in place. His training kicked in, reminding him to stay calm and assess the situation carefully. He knew that reacting impulsively could make things worse. Instead, he focused on controlling his breathing, steadying himself for whatever came next. The dog was fast, closing the distance between them in seconds. For a moment, it seemed like all hell would break loose. Yet, something unexpected happened. James didn't panic. Instead, he prepared to face the threat head-on, determined to handle the situation without losing his composure or compromising his values. As the crowd held its collective breath, unsure of how the confrontation would unfold, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary day in the park. What happened next would leave everyone talking and questioning everything they thought they knew about courage, discipline, and humanity. As the Doberman lunged toward him, its teeth bared and eyes locked onto James with fierce intensity, time seemed to slow down. The crowd froze, their faces a mix of fear and anticipation. Some people instinctively reached for their phones to record the moment, while others covered their mouths in shock. For James, however, there was no room for panic. His training as a royal guard had prepared him for high-pressure situations, but nothing could have fully readied him for this, a snarling dog charging at him in the middle of a public park. James' mind raced, though his outward demeanor remained calm. He knew that reacting violently or showing fear would only escalate the situation. Striking the animal might provoke it further, and worse, it could tarnish the image of discipline and professionalism that the Royal Guard represented. Instead, he relied on his instincts and years of experience handling unpredictable scenarios. Taking a deep breath, he tightened his grip on his ceremonial staff, holding it firmly but not aggressively. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tool to create space between himself and the dog if needed. The dog was inches away now, its growls reverberating through the park. James made a split-second decision. Rather than raising his staff defensively, he did something unexpected. He lowered himself. Dropping to one knee, He brought himself closer to the dog's level. This move confused both the animal and the onlookers. Why wasn't he standing tall? Why wasn't he fighting back? To the average person, kneeling might have seemed like an act of submission, but James knew better. Dogs are highly perceptive creatures, and they often respond more positively when humans meet them at eye level rather than towering over them. With slow, deliberate movements, James extended his gloved hand toward the dog, palm facing downward. His voice cut through the tension like a soothing melody. "Easy now," he murmured softly, his tone steady and reassuring. "You're okay." The words were simple, almost whispered, yet they carried a weight that reached beyond human ears. The dog paused mid-stride, its aggressive stance faltering. Its snarls softened into low whimpers, and its sharp gaze softened as it sniffed the air cautiously. Victor, still fuming nearby, shouted angrily, urging his dog to attack. "Get him. What are you waiting for?" he barked, frustration evident in his voice. But the dog didn't listen. Instead, it took another hesitant step forward, its nose twitching as it caught James' scent. Something about the guard's calm energy intrigued the animal. Perhaps it was the absence of fear or the gentle way James spoke. Whatever it was, the dog began to relax. Its body language shifted from hostile to curious, and within moments it sat obediently at James' feet, tail wagging slightly. The crowd erupted into murmurs of astonishment. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others smiled, clearly moved by what they had just witnessed. James remained focused, maintaining his composure even as Victor continued to shout insults from behind. For James, this wasn't just about subduing a dog. It was about proving that compassion and patience could triumph over aggression. And in that moment, surrounded by chaos and hostility, he stood as a living testament to those values. Though the immediate threat had passed, the situation was far from resolved. Victor's rage boiled over, and the attention of everyone in the park was now fixed on the unfolding drama. Little did they know, this incident was only the beginning of a story that would leave a lasting impact on all who witnessed it. As the Doberman sat calmly at James' feet, wagging its tail and looking up at him with trusting eyes, the atmosphere in the park shifted dramatically. The angry growls had faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by Victor's increasingly frantic shouts. "Get up, Max. Attack him," he yelled, his voice cracking under the weight of his frustration. But the dog, now named Max, ignored its owner completely. Instead, it leaned slightly against James' leg, as if seeking comfort from the very person it had been sent to harm just moments before. James remained still, his expression unreadable behind the stoic mask of duty he wore so well. Inside, however, his thoughts raced. He understood that this moment was about more than just a dog or a single act of aggression. It was a reflection of something deeper, a clash between hatred and humanity. As much as Victor tried to command authority over the situation, it was clear who held the real power now. Not the man shouting orders, but the calm figure on one knee whose actions spoke louder than words. Slowly, James rose to his full height, towering above Victor despite being younger and physically smaller. His movements were deliberate, each step measured and controlled. When he finally turned to face Victor, there was no anger in his gaze, only quiet resolve. "Sir," he began, his voice firm yet respectful, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your dog is clearly distressed. Perhaps you should consider training methods that don't involve instilling hatred in innocent creatures." The words hit Victor like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, he looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort but finding none. Then, fury overtook him again. "Don't lecture me," he snapped, pointing a trembling finger at James. "You think you're so superior, don't you? Standing there in your fancy uniform, acting all high and mighty." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Bystanders exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads in disgust, while others openly mocked Victor under their breath. One woman holding her child's hand muttered loud enough for those around her to hear, "If anyone's behaving badly here, it's him." Another man nearby nodded in agreement, adding, "That poor dog doesn't deserve someone like that as an owner." Victor, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, lunged forward to grab Max's leash, but the dog refused to budge, staying loyally by James' side. No matter how hard Victor tugged or shouted, Max stayed put, his loyalty shifting entirely to the man who had shown him kindness instead of cruelty. This betrayal stung Victor deeply, and his face turned red with embarrassment and rage. "Come here, you useless mutt," he screamed, yanking harder on the leash. Still, Max didn't move. The absurdity of the scene drew laughter from some members of the crowd. A teenage boy filming the incident on his phone chuckled, saying to his friend, "Looks like the dog knows exactly where it wants to be." Others joined in, their amusement further fueling Victor's humiliation. Even the tourists, many of whom barely understood English, could sense the dynamic at play. They pointed and gestured, clearly siding with James. Meanwhile, James stood tall, exuding a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Though he said nothing more, his presence alone seemed to amplify the message he had already delivered. Hatred and aggression would never win against patience and compassion. And as the murmurs of approval grew louder, Victor found himself increasingly isolated, his attempts to assert dominance crumbling into dust. What happened next would seal the fate of this encounter forever. With the crowd firmly on James' side and Victor struggling to regain any semblance of authority, the stage was set for a reckoning that neither man nor dog would soon forget. As the tension in the park reached its peak, Victor's frustration boiled over into outright fury. His face was flushed red, veins popping out on his forehead as he continued to shout commands at Max, his Doberman. But the dog remained steadfastly loyal to James, refusing to budge from the guard's side. Each failed attempt to reclaim control only deepened Victor's humiliation, and his voice grew louder and more erratic. "Max, get over here right now," he bellowed, yanking violently on the leash. The sound of his shouting echoed through the park, drawing even more attention from passersby. The crowd, however, wasn't sympathetic. Far from it. People began openly mocking Victor, their voices rising in unison against him. A young woman holding a coffee cup shook her head and muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear, "What a joke. He can't even control his own dog." Another man chimed in, crossing his arms as he observed the scene. "Looks like the dog has better judgment than its owner," he said with a smirk, earning nods and chuckles from others around him. Even children, sensing the shift in energy, giggled nervously while pointing at the spectacle unfolding before them. Victor, realizing he was losing not just his grip on Max, but also the support, or at least the neutrality, of the crowd, became desperate. He lunged forward again, this time grabbing the leash with both hands and pulling with all his might. But Max planted his paws firmly on the ground, resisting Victor's efforts entirely. Instead of moving toward his owner, the dog leaned closer to James, almost as if seeking protection. This act of defiance from the animal was the final blow to Victor's ego. His shoulders slumped momentarily, and for a brief second, he looked utterly defeated. But defeat didn't sit well with Victor. With clenched fists and gritted teeth, he turned his rage back onto James. "This is your fault," he spat, jabbing a finger in the guard's direction. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? Interfering where you don't belong." His words were sharp, but they lacked conviction. It was clear to everyone watching that Victor was flailing, grasping at straws in a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. James, ever composed, met Victor's accusations with unwavering calm. "Sir," he replied evenly, his tone measured and devoid of hostility, "I did nothing more than show your dog kindness. If anything, this reflects poorly on how you treat it." The simplicity of his response struck a chord, not just with Victor, but with everyone present. There was no theatrics, no attempt to humiliate or belittle, just honesty, delivered with quiet authority. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, turning into a collective wave of disapproval aimed squarely at Victor. Some people clapped, applauding James' restraint and compassion. Others recorded videos on their phones, capturing every word and gesture. One elderly woman stepped forward slightly, shaking her head as she addressed Victor directly. "Shame on you," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "That poor animal deserves better than someone like you." Victor's face twisted in anger, but he seemed unable to respond. For once, his usual bravado failed him. The weight of public opinion pressed down on him, leaving him cornered and exposed. As much as he wanted to lash out further, there was nowhere left for him to go. Every insult, every accusation, only dug him deeper into a hole of his own making. Finally, the sound of distant sirens broke through the commotion. Someone in the crowd must have called the authorities, recognizing the escalating nature of the confrontation. The wail of police cars approaching signaled the beginning of the end for this chaotic scene. Officers soon arrived, their presence immediately calming the atmosphere. They quickly assessed the situation, separating James and Victor while speaking to witnesses and gathering details. For James, the arrival of law enforcement meant relief, not because he feared for his safety, he never had, but because it marked the moment when order would be restored. For Victor, however, it was a different story. As officers questioned him, his body language shifted from defiant to defensive. The realization that he might face consequences for his actions began to sink in, and for the first time, he appeared genuinely shaken. What followed next would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. The ripple effects of this encounter would extend far beyond the park, sparking conversations about accountability, prejudice, and the power of compassion. And though James returned to his post without fanfare, his actions that day would inspire countless others to choose kindness over cruelty, even in the face of hatred. The arrival of the police officers brought a new layer of seriousness to the scene. Their presence immediately drew a line between order and chaos as they began separating James and Victor while addressing the growing crowd. "Everyone, please step back," one officer instructed firmly but calmly, raising his hand to signal the onlookers to give them space. The crowd reluctantly obeyed, though whispers and murmurs continued to ripple through the group like a steady tide. Cameras still flashed, capturing every detail, while some people lingered at the edges, unwilling to miss what might happen next. The officers first approached James, who stood tall and composed, his uniform impeccable despite the ordeal he had just endured. One of the officers, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, asked him to recount what had happened. James spoke clearly and concisely, sticking to the facts without embellishment or emotion. He described how Victor had hurled insults at him, then unleashed his dog in an aggressive manner. When asked about his response, James simply explained that he had acted according to his training, remaining calm and using nonviolent methods to de-escalate the situation. His tone was respectful, almost humble, as if deflecting any praise for his actions. Meanwhile, another officer turned their attention to Victor, whose face was a mix of anger and anxiety. The man's earlier bravado seemed to crumble under the weight of official scrutiny. As the officer questioned him, Victor's answers grew defensive and disjointed. "He provoked me," Victor insisted, pointing an accusatory finger at James. "I was just walking my dog, minding my own business, when he decided to interfere." His voice rose with each word, betraying his desperation to shift blame. But his claims fell flat, especially when witnesses stepped forward to share their accounts. Several bystanders eagerly volunteered information, eager to ensure justice was served. A young couple holding hands recounted how Victor had shouted racial slurs before ordering his dog to attack. It was horrifying, the woman said, her voice trembling slightly as she recalled the moment. "We thought something terrible was going to happen." Another witness, an older gentleman wearing a tweed jacket, added, "That poor lad didn't do anything wrong." If anything, he showed incredible restraint. Most people would have reacted violently in his position. Even Max, the Doberman, seemed to play a role in corroborating the story. When the officers examined the dog, it responded to their commands hesitantly, clearly uneasy around Victor. However, when James called out softly to the animal, Max perked up instantly, wagging its tail and trotting over to sit obediently by his side once again. This small interaction didn't go unnoticed by the officers, who exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the significance of the dog's behavior. As the investigation unfolded, Victor's agitation grew more apparent. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled as he tried to justify his actions. "Look, I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he stammered, his voice losing its earlier edge. The dog got excited, that's all. But his excuses only made him appear guiltier. The officers took note of his erratic behavior and documented everything meticulously, aware that this case carried broader implications beyond a simple altercation in the park. By the time the initial questioning wrapped up, it was clear that Victor was in serious trouble. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Eyewitness testimonies, video footage captured by onlookers, and even the dog's refusal to obey him painted a damning picture. The officers informed Victor that he would need to accompany them to the station for further questioning. As they led him away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and he avoided making eye contact with anyone, particularly James. For James, the resolution of the immediate crisis allowed him to return to his duties. Though shaken by the intensity of the encounter, he resumed his post outside Buckingham Palace with the same quiet dignity that defined him. Yet he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, knowing that the incident wasn't truly over. It was merely transitioning into a legal battle that would dominate headlines in the days to come. Little did James know, however, that this confrontation would spark conversations far beyond the confines of the park. News outlets quickly picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of resilience and humanity in the face of hatred. And as the world watched, waiting to see what would happen next, one thing became undeniable. This single day in the park had changed lives, not just for those directly involved, but for countless others inspired by the courage of a young guard who chose compassion over conflict. Within hours, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with posts and videos capturing James' calm demeanor and quick thinking. The footage of him kneeling to soothe Max, juxtaposed with Victor's angry outbursts, became a viral sensation. Journalists scrambled to piece together the story, dubbing it "The Day the Guard Tamed Hate." Headlines across newspapers and online outlets praised James' actions, calling him a symbol of grace under pressure. For many, the video wasn't just a clip. It was a powerful reminder of how compassion could triumph over hostility. As the story gained traction, public opinion overwhelmingly sided with James. People from all walks of life shared their admiration for his restraint and professionalism. "This is what true strength looks like," one commenter wrote beneath a widely shared post. Another added, "He didn't let hate win. That's leadership right there." Memes began circulating online, humorously depicting James as everything from a superhero to a modern-day diplomat. Even late-night talk show hosts joked about the incident, using it as an example of how kindness can disarm even the angriest opponents. Despite the flood of attention, James remained steadfastly humble. Reporters camped outside Buckingham Palace, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or secure an exclusive interview. But James declined every request, adhering to the strict code of conduct expected of a royal guard. When pressed by senior officers about whether he wanted to issue a statement, he simply replied, "I acted according to my values and training." No more, no less. His modesty only fueled public admiration further. To the world, he became not just a soldier but a quiet hero who embodied integrity and humanity. Victor, on the other hand, found himself at the center of widespread ridicule and condemnation. Clips of his shouting matches with both James and the police were replayed endlessly, serving as a stark contrast to the calmness displayed by the young guard. Online forums dissected his behavior, labeling him as a cautionary tale of unchecked prejudice and misplaced anger. Some debated whether stricter laws were needed to address racial hatred in public spaces, while others called for reforms in pet ownership regulations to prevent similar incidents involving animals. Amidst the buzz, experts weighed in on the psychological aspects of the confrontation. Animal trainers highlighted how James' approach, kneeling, speaking softly, and offering reassurance, was textbook in calming an agitated dog. Psychologists noted that his ability to remain composed under such intense scrutiny demonstrated exceptional emotional intelligence. Meanwhile, social commentators pointed out the broader significance of the event, framing it as a reflection of societal struggles against racism and intolerance. James didn't just tame a dog. He tamed a moment of ugliness, one analyst remarked during a televised segment. His actions remind us that we always have a choice in how we respond to hate. The ripple effects extended beyond London. Schools began discussing the incident in classrooms, using it as a teaching moment about empathy and conflict resolution. Parents told their children stories of the brave guard who stood firm against adversity without resorting to anger. Even politicians referenced the event in speeches, urging citizens to emulate James' poise and moral courage in their daily lives. For James, however, life continued much as it had before. He returned to his duties, standing tall and silent outside the palace gates, seemingly unfazed by the whirlwind surrounding him. Yet those who knew him well noticed subtle changes. A slight softening in his expression when tourists waved at him, or the way he occasionally glanced at dogs passing by with newfound warmth. Though he never sought recognition, the incident left its mark on him too, reinforcing his belief in the power of patience and understanding. As days turned into weeks, the frenzy slowly began to die down. But the legacy of that day lingered, etched into the memories of everyone who witnessed it. What started as a tense encounter in a park had transformed into something far greater, a beacon of hope in a world often divided by fear and animosity. And though James might never fully grasp the magnitude of his impact, his actions served as proof that even in the face of hatred, small acts of kindness could inspire change on a global scale. Victor's court appearance was the next chapter in a story that had already captivated the public. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and even a few supporters of James who showed up to witness justice being served. Cameras flashed outside as Victor arrived, his face pale and drawn, looking nothing like the angry man from the park. He shuffled into the room flanked by his lawyer, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Gone was the arrogance he had displayed during the incident. Instead, he seemed nervous, fidgeting with his tie, and glancing anxiously at the judge. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They presented video evidence showing Victor hurling insults at James before commanding his dog to attack. Witnesses were called to testify, including several bystanders who recounted how unsettling and aggressive Victor's behavior had been. One woman, visibly emotional as she spoke, described hearing racial slurs that made her feel unsafe just standing there. Another witness, a father with 2 young children, explained how Victor's actions traumatized his kids, leaving them afraid of dogs for days afterward. Even Max, the Doberman, played a role in the proceedings. An animal behavior expert testified about the dog's demeanor during the incident, noting signs of fear and confusion likely caused by poor training methods. The expert suggested that Victor's harsh commands and lack of positive reinforcement created an unstable environment for Max. When asked why the dog responded so well to James but ignored its owner, the expert replied, "Dogs are incredibly perceptive. They can sense hostility versus calmness. In this case, the dog chose the person who offered safety and reassurance." Victor's defense attorney tried to downplay the severity of the charges, arguing that his client hadn't intended to harm anyone. This was a misunderstanding, the lawyer claimed, attempting to paint Victor as someone whose frustrations got the better of him. But the argument fell flat when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Even Victor's own dog trainer admitted under cross-examination that he had used outdated and punitive techniques when working with Max, which likely contributed to the animal's erratic behavior. When it came time for sentencing, the judge spared no words in condemning Victor's actions. "What you did that day goes beyond recklessness," the judge said sternly, staring directly at Victor. "You not only endangered the life of another human being, but also subjected your dog to unnecessary stress and fear. Your conduct reflects poorly on society as a whole." With those remarks, the judge handed down a hefty fine and mandated anger management classes for Victor. Additionally, Max was temporarily removed from Victor's care pending further evaluation by animal welfare authorities. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as the verdict was announced. Some people clapped, while others held up signs praising James and calling for greater accountability in cases involving racism and animal cruelty. A small group of activists used the opportunity to advocate for stricter laws protecting both humans and animals from abusive situations. For many, the ruling felt like a victory, not just for James, but for anyone who had ever faced prejudice or witnessed mistreatment of vulnerable creatures. For Victor, the consequences extended far beyond legal penalties. His reputation was in tatters, with neighbors avoiding him and former friends distancing themselves. Local businesses refused to serve him, citing concerns over bad publicity. Worst of all, he lost custody of Max permanently after evaluations revealed the dog thrived best in a nurturing environment. Eventually, Max was adopted by a family trained in gentle handling techniques, where he blossomed into a therapy dog, bringing comfort to patients in hospitals, a fitting transformation for an animal once weaponized by hatred. Though the court case marked the official end of the saga, its lessons lingered. It served as a stark reminder that actions have repercussions, not just legally, but socially and emotionally. For Victor, the experience became a bitter pill to swallow, forcing him to confront the damage his prejudices had caused. And for everyone else, it reinforced the importance of treating others, and even animals, with kindness and respect. As the world moved on, the echoes of that day in the park continued to resonate, reminding us all of the power of compassion in the face of adversity. Months passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm for James Harper. He resumed his duties as a royal guard, standing tall and steadfast outside Buckingham Palace, his presence as unshakable as ever. To the tourists snapping photos and the locals hurrying past, he was just another figure in the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, a symbol of tradition and discipline. But to those who knew the full story, James was much more than that. He had become a quiet beacon of hope, proof that even in moments of hatred and chaos, humanity could shine through. Though James never sought recognition, the impact of his actions rippled far beyond the park where it all began. People continued to share stories inspired by his courage, using them as examples of how to respond to conflict with grace and composure. Teachers incorporated the incident into lessons about empathy, while community leaders referenced it in speeches advocating for unity and understanding. Even social media remained abuzz with tributes, with hashtags like #GuardianOfPeace still popping up occasionally alongside heartfelt messages thanking James for reminding the world of the power of kindness. For Max, the once aggressive Doberman, life took a remarkable turn. After being placed in the care of a loving family trained in positive reinforcement techniques, the dog flourished. His natural instincts to protect and serve found new purpose as he became a therapy dog, visiting hospitals and nursing homes to bring comfort to patients. The same animal that had been used as a tool of aggression now brought joy and healing to those in need. It was a transformation so profound that it felt almost poetic, a living testament to the idea that redemption is possible, even in the most unlikely forms. Victor Langley, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. His name occasionally surfaced in discussions about accountability and prejudice, but always as a cautionary tale. Stripped of his dog and ostracized by his community, he spent months reflecting on the choices that led him to that fateful day in the park. Some whispered that he had begun attending anger management classes reluctantly, though no one knew for sure if he truly changed or simply went through the motions to satisfy legal requirements. Either way, his actions served as a stark reminder of the harm caused by unchecked hatred, both to others and to oneself. As for James, he carried the memory of that day quietly, letting it shape him without defining him. On rare occasions, when tourists recognized him from news reports and approached him to express gratitude, he would nod politely and say, "I only did what anyone should do." His humility endeared him even more to those around him, earning him not just respect, but genuine admiration. Fellow guards often joked that James was now too famous for the job, but they couldn't help but feel proud to serve alongside someone who embodied the values they all aspire to uphold. The incident also sparked broader conversations about racism, compassion, and the role individuals play in shaping society. Community organizations launched campaigns encouraging people to confront prejudice in their daily lives, urging them to follow James' example of responding to hostility with calmness and dignity. Animal rights groups seized the opportunity to promote responsible pet ownership, emphasizing the importance of treating animals with care and patience. In many ways, what started as a single moment of bravery blossomed into a movement for positive change. Years later, when James eventually retired from service, he did so with little fanfare, slipping away from the spotlight just as quietly as he had lived within it. Yet his legacy endured, not in statues or monuments, but in the countless lives he touched. From the children who learned about kindness because of him to the strangers who chose compassion over anger after hearing his story, James' influence stretched far beyond anything he could have imagined. And so, the tale of the racist man, the loyal dog, and the courageous guard came full circle. It was a story of contrasts: hatred versus love, aggression versus restraint, despair versus redemption. But above all, it was a story of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always room for light. As James marched off into retirement, his head held high and his heart full of quiet pride, he left behind a world just a little bit kinder because of him.